Hey, I'm going to do a different kind of video today. This is going to be a movie review. This is a movie I have looked forward to for a long time. Ridley Scott's new movie, Napoleon, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Vanessa Kirby. There's already a lot of reviews out there on it, and to be honest, they're very mixed. And as you can guess from the title, my opinion of it is on the whole very positive. Before I get into that, just to kind of detail, yesterday I went and saw the movie Napoleon, and part of the reason I saw it is because today's Thanksgiving, I'm off from work, and I had kind of a big day yesterday. I had a couple of interviews, one of which was enormously important, another one which was kind of a side step, kind of a backup, I guess you could say. But right now, I kind of need a new job because my current job sucks. So I was in a pretty celebratory mood yesterday. I usually don't buy food at the theaters almost ever because it's so stinking expensive. But, I for once splurged on some popcorn and some drink as well as I brought some of my own, special sauce from home in a flask. But, anyways, it was a pretty good experience seeing Napoleon in theaters yesterday. Um, I went very late at night because I had to go after work. My shift ends at 9 o'clock. And then around, 10:30, I saw the movie, left around 2 a.m. in the morning. And it was great. I mean, seeing it, there was almost nobody there, which was a little weird, I know. And going alone was kind of weird. But there was it was just me and three other people in the theater because of how late it was at night. And, but it was one of those surround sound type of things where the battle scenes were just epic. And on the whole, this movie was one of my favorite ever. And when I see the director's cut, which I hear is even better, it might be my favorite movie ever. Next to only The Dark Knight and Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, which are my two top favorites at the moment. But this definitely cracks the top 10 either way. You know, one reason is obviously that I just like Napoleon. I like history, and as you can tell by one of my small paintings here in the background, Napoleon is my favorite historical figure. I have a much bigger painting that I still have not been able to get hung up yet because sometimes it's kind of tricky in an apartment. It's a very heavy painting, and you have to be careful what time of day you hang it because you have to, put the studs in and all. And I don't want to bother my neighbors, so I've had it for 2 years and haven't got it hung back up. It's in a closet, but it's a really cool painting of Napoleon. Um, but anyways, sorry if I'm getting a little bit off topic here. I'm just trying to give you some backstory about why I like Napoleon. But anyways, this movie was very, very good. And probably was not by most people's measures a masterpiece, though, because there were a few flaws in this movie that kept it from being like an all-time classic. However, I can forgive them personally, all of the flaws in the movie. First, I'm going to go into everything that was done right with this movie before I go into the flaws. Battle scenes were some of the best you'll ever see. Maybe in all cinematic history thus far to date. It mixed CGI with live action in a way that you don't see very often. The battle scenes were, in and of themselves, a reason to see the movie. Especially, I think my personal favorite during the movie was probably the battle at Austerlitz. It's already on YouTube on trailers, but it was even better in the full battle. Um, and other things done right. Vanessa Kirby and Joaquin Phoenix were great in their roles. And here's where a lot of critics of this movie show their own ignorance of history when they say Joaquin Phoenix was a miscast. Napoleon was not necessarily this all-powerful person wherever he went. He was not necessarily socially, the most adept person in the world. When he was younger, in particular, he was very socially awkward. Um, Definitely in his love life in the early years, he was not very good when it came to dating and it came to women. One French woman said that he cut a very sickly figure. That was the effect she said that was created looking at him because he was very skinny, pale yellow skin, long greasy hair. And then when he got older, he's one of those guys who went from being very skinny and young looking to just boom, overnight he developed a pot belly and got really old and fat looking. So he wasn't ever really a looker or anything, but Joaquin Phoenix captured that vulnerable side of Napoleon. And I think Ridley Scott did a perfect choice in casting him. And Vanessa Kirby, well, let me put it this way. I loved her in this role. She may not have been 100% accurate to what Josephine was like, but to be honest, she probably was easier on the eyes than Josephine would have been in real life. I mean, Josephine was not an ugly lady, but to be honest with you, from what I read about her, she was not as attractive as Napoleon thought she was, or some other people thought she was. She had really bad teeth. And to be honest, casting Vanessa Kirby, the only negative is that she probably was a lot hotter than Josephine would be, but what can I say? That's a forgivable cinema sin. She was certainly not hard to watch throughout the movie. And their relationship was very historically accurate in this movie. I know a lot of people are criticizing the relationship in this movie, but that actually was very true to his relationship with Josephine. It was not a perfect romance. They were very exploitative of each other. In the early years, Josephine exploited Napoleon more. In the later years, one could say he exploited her or maybe just disregarded her more. And what I mean by that is, like, in the early years, she had a bunch of affairs on him. She basically married him just for money and protection. Napoleon married her so he could kind of get in with the social circles of power. He got his first commission partially due to Josephine in one of his top military commissions. So, I mean, it was not this wonderful Hollywood romance. And if anything, the movie glossed it up just a little bit, but a lot of people still, it wasn't glossed up enough for their tastes. So there was a lot of people all over YouTube and critics talking about how this romance was just not up to their expectations because it basically was not the Hollywood romance they were wanting it to be. And I guess another thing I liked, I mean, the movies was just beautifully shot. I loved just the coloration of the movie. I loved the uniform. I loved the costumes. I loved and just even like the scenes like where Russia was burning, where they go into Moscow and Moscow's deserted and then Russia burns, just like the site where he and his top advisors were all going in, to the deserted Russian Kremlin. And he's got all these massive sized men around him, where Joaquin Phoenix is kind of an average sized guy, but he looks really short compared to them. That kind of reminds me of how they say Napoleon really was average height, but then compared to all the massive men around him, he looked small, which is why he was always berated for being short. But this movie, it had a lot of things like that in it that I loved and were done very right. And now for the things that were not done so right. And the one thing I will definitely agree with critics on is that this movie was made more for people who already know Napoleon, like myself, and who are already a fan of Napoleon, than they were for people who are not familiar with him. And that was the biggest flaw of this movie that kept it from being a masterpiece. There definitely should have been a cut in this movie. Of the 2.5 hours, a cut of it should have been dedicated to the first 20 years of his life, because Napoleon was not always a happy person. In fact, he really, for the most part, wasn't a happy person. And in the early years of his life, he thought about suicide a lot because he was one of those people that if he couldn't live life to the fullest, he just didn't want to live it at all. If he couldn't be in power, if he couldn't advance up, he just hated existing. He wrote about suicide a lot. He was very depressed, had a lot of troubles dating, was kind of a loner. And that would have given people a little bit of context as to what, made him so, pathological in his upward advancement towards power and conquest, And I think that was what the biggest flaw of the movie. Another flaw or two of this movie was it was a little choppy. It's hard to imagine for a 2.5 hour movie that it'd be choppy, but it was. It covered so many things that it left out some very key aspects. Like the biggest thing I think what was too choppy in the movie is like when they went during the Russian invasion. That was such a small part of the movie, and they made it look like he lost maybe a few dozen men in the cold. It shows the Battle of Borodino, then a few scenes of French soldiers starving, in the cold, and you see like a few of them die or something. It's like you would think that it was like just this minor thing, but that was actually the biggest part of the Napoleonic Wars and the part that really led to his downfall, and they really sidestepped that a lot. And that was a mistake on the part of Ridley Scott. But not unforgivable. It's just to somebody that doesn't already understand the history of it, going straight from scene to him, marching into Moscow to him abdicating his throne in France was so rushed that you just didn't even get the measure of what happened, And in that sense, the 4.5 hour director's cut probably will encompass that better, I imagine. which is, of course, why I'm looking forward to it. And maybe that will also have an early introduction into Napoleon's life in it. But it's 2.5 hours is long enough. You know, if you've got a movie that long, you should be able, as Shakespeare once said, brevity is the soul of wit. If you can tell it, should be able to fit it into 2 hours, you know. And he could have cut out a lot of the boring political stuff in the middle. He could have cut out some of the slightly overly emphasized romance between Josephine and Napoleon. So there was the criticisms of it. They kept this movie from being a masterpiece, you know. But, you know, we don't all like the same things. And even though this movie wasn't a masterpiece, it was definitely one of my favorite movies ever. And the director's cut maybe just is going to be my favorite ever. I won't know until I see it. But, you know, this movie, it had if you like Napoleon, you will love this movie. I can say that. If you like, if you really have a deep historical knowledge, I don't mean if you just once read a thing about him, you know, and watched one documentary on him. I mean, you have to have an in-depth knowledge of Napoleon to like this movie, because this covers a lot of aspects of his career and life that people don't understand or maybe have misinformation on, such as that Napoleon was a warmonger. He was a bit of a warmonger, but a lot of the wars he fought were defensive. In fact, primarily they were defensive. And the French Revolution was, before he came into power, just kind of chaotic, and Napoleon brought order to it, you know. So there was a lot of things, there's a lot of misinformation about Napoleon that somebody who would watch this movie would not feel inclined to feel sympathy or identify with Napoleon, because of how they don't really give you reasons to identify with him. And, you know, so I will agree with the critics, it's not a masterpiece. But for those who think that this movie was just terrible, you know, in terms of just being objectively terrible, and that it, you know, was not historically accurate, well, they really, I mean, to some extent, that shows a lack of knowledge of history. Again, I'm not saying if you don't like this movie, you're ignorant. I'm not saying you have to like it. We all have different tastes. What I am saying, though, is if you really think that this is bad because it's butchering the life story of Napoleon, then you need to rethink history a little bit. It wasn't a documentary, it was a movie. But this was much more historically accurate than some of Ridley Scott's other movies like Gladiator or Exodus, Gods and Kings, you know. So it was a great movie. I would strongly recommend it. I'm going to be seeing it again in only a few weeks when I go to visit my family for the holidays, and I don't even know if I can wait till then to see it again. You know, it was so good. I would strongly recommend you see it, especially if you like history and Napoleon. And this is definitely a movie that's good to see in theaters, because the battle scenes, you can literally feel the cannon fire in a movie theater. So, as usual, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.